Everyone has heard the term Ponzi scheme. Every time a fraudulent investment collapses, every time impossible profits are promised, every time billions of dollars disappear, someone says the same thing. It's a Ponzi scheme. But who was Ponzi? How did an unknown immigrant become so famous that his name became part of the English language? And how did a man with almost no money convince thousands of people to hand him their life savings? This is the story of Charles Ponzi, the man who made history by selling a dream. Boston, summer, 1920. The line begins before sunrise. Men in worn factory clothes stand shoulder to shoulder beside wealthy businessmen in tailored suits. Housewives clutch savings books against their chests. Shop owners hold envelopes filled with cash. Immigrants wait patiently, speaking Italian, English, and half a dozen other languages. Some arrived hours ago, others arrived yesterday. No one wants to lose their place. Because inside a modest office building sits a man who seems to possess a supernatural gift. The gift of turning money into more money, not over years, not over decades, but in just 45 days. A 50% return, guaranteed. The promise sounds ridiculous, impossible, dangerous, and yet the crowd keeps growing, because people are receiving checks, real profits. Neighbors are becoming investors are becoming evangelists. And newspapers across America are beginning to ask a simple question. Who is Charles Ponzi? Is he a financial genius, a visionary, a miracle worker, or something far more dangerous? At that very moment, thousands of people are making the biggest financial decision of their lives. Some are investing savings, others are investing businesses, a few are investing everything, and none of them realize they are standing inside one of the most famous scams in history. A scam so legendary that more than a century later, the world still uses the name of the man who created it. Every time a fraudulent investment collapses, every time impossible returns are promised, every time greed overwhelms caution, his name returns. Ponzi. This is the story of Charles Ponzi, the man who turned hope into a fortune, and a fortune into a warning. More than 100 years later, his name remains alive. Most criminals are forgotten. Most fraudsters disappear into footnotes. Most scandals fade with time. Charles Ponzi became something different. He became a definition. Today, people who have never heard his life story still know his name. They hear it in news reports, financial investigations, courtrooms, investment scandals. The term survives because the idea survives. The promise survives. The dream survives. A dream as old as money itself. The belief that somewhere, somehow, there exists a shortcut, a hidden opportunity, a secret path to wealth that everyone else has missed. Charles Ponzi didn't invent that dream, but he understood it, perhaps better than anyone before him. And for a brief moment in 1920, he convinced an entire nation that he had found it. To understand how that happened, we have to travel back long before the crowds, long before the headlines, long before the fortune. Back to Italy, to a young man with impossible ambitions, a man who wanted more from life than life seemed willing to give him. Chapter 1. The Dreamer. Charles Ponzi was born in 1882 in Lugo, Italy. At the time, Italy was a young nation. Unification had happened only a few decades earlier. The country was still finding its identity. For many families, opportunity remained scarce. Economic hardship was common, dreams were plentiful, jobs were not. Charles came from a family that had once enjoyed a degree of prosperity. But by the time he was growing up, much of that prosperity had faded. The family was respectable, educated, neither rich nor destitute. Yet young Charles was surrounded by stories of people who had once possessed more. Stories of lost fortunes, lost status, lost opportunities, and perhaps because of that, he developed an obsession. Success. Not comfort, not stability. Success. The kind that transformed lives, the kind that made ordinary people extraordinary. While other children imagined professions, Charles imagined fortunes. He dreamed of wealth. influence, recognition. He wanted to matter. And during the late 19th century, there was one place that dominated the imagination of ambitious young Europeans: America. The stories traveled across oceans. Letters arrived from relatives and friends, stories of factories, railroads, new cities, new fortunes, new beginnings. Some stories were exaggerated, some were entirely true. It hardly mattered. To millions of Europeans, America represented possibility itself. The land where identities could be reinvented, where failures could start over, where ordinary people could become rich. Young Charles absorbed those stories like fuel. The more he heard, the more convinced he became. His future was not in Italy. His future was somewhere else, somewhere bigger, somewhere richer, somewhere waiting. Years later, he would describe his mindset with remarkable honesty. He didn't want a small life. He didn't want gradual progress. He wanted success on a grand scale. The problem was that ambition alone rarely changes reality. Dreams require action, and eventually Charles reached a decision shared by millions of immigrants before him. If opportunity would not come to him, he would go to opportunity. In 1903, at the age of 21, Charles Ponzi boarded a ship bound for America. He carried little money, little experience, little certainty. But he carried something else: hope. And hope can be a powerful thing. Powerful enough to cross an ocean, powerful enough to endure hardship, powerful enough to convince a young man that his future awaited him on the other side of the world. As the ship disappeared toward the horizon, Charles believed he was sailing toward success. He had no way of knowing that failure was waiting for him first. Chapter 2. The Failed Immigrant. When Charles Ponzi arrived in America, reality arrived with him. The America of imagination and the America of reality were not always the same place. Millions of immigrants learned that lesson the hard way. Charles was no exception. He landed in Boston with dreams of wealth and very little money. At first, the city must have seemed extraordinary. Crowded streets, factories, businesses, opportunity everywhere. But opportunity does not guarantee success, especially for a young immigrant with few connections and little experience. The jobs available were often difficult, poorly paid, temporary, far removed from the glamorous future he had imagined. Charles drifted between occupations, small jobs, odd work, anything that paid enough to survive. Yet survival was not what he wanted. He wanted more, always more. And that restless ambition became both his greatest strength and his greatest weakness. Because while many immigrants accepted slow progress, Charles remained convinced that he was destined for something bigger: a breakthrough, a shortcut, a life-changing opportunity. Unfortunately, reality kept refusing to cooperate. Money disappeared almost as quickly as he earned it. Jobs came and went. Stability remained frustratingly out of reach. At times, life became genuinely difficult. There were periods when Charles struggled to support himself, periods when his grand dreams must have felt very far away. Imagine him walking through Boston at night, watching successful businessmen leave restaurants, seeing wealthy customers enter hotels, reading newspaper stories about fortunes being made, and wondering why success seemed so easy for everyone else. Yet despite everything, Charles never abandoned the belief that he would eventually make it. Failure discouraged him. It did not defeat him. If anything, failure strengthened a dangerous idea already growing inside his mind: the belief that traditional paths to success were too slow, too limited, too ordinary. Some people are willing to spend decades climbing a ladder. Charles increasingly wanted to find a faster route, and that desire would shape the rest of his life. Over the next several years, he would move, change jobs, meet new people, chase new opportunities, some legitimate, some questionable, many unsuccessful. But every setback taught him something. Not about business, not about finance, about people, about hope, about desperation, about the powerful emotions that drive human decisions. Lessons that would later become worth millions. The irony is that Charles Ponzi spent years failing, years being ignored, years being overlooked. No crowds waited for him, No newspapers celebrated him, no investors trusted him. He was just another struggling immigrant trying to build a future. And yet hidden inside those years of frustration was the foundation of everything that would come later. Because failure can teach lessons that success never does. And Charles was about to learn one of the most important lessons of his life. A lesson that would eventually make him famous. A lesson delivered through something surprisingly ordinary. A letter, a simple letter from overseas. One piece of mail, one small idea, and one opportunity that appeared too good to ignore. Chapter 3. Learning the game. Failure has a way of changing people. Some become cautious, others become bitter. Charles Ponzi became observant. For years he had chased success without finding it. Now he began paying closer attention to the people who seemed to possess it. Bankers, investors, businessmen, men who understood how money moved through society. Because the more Charles struggled, the more he realized something important. Money was never just money. Money was confidence, trust, belief. People handed over their savings every day because they trusted institutions, banks, businesses, governments. The entire financial system depended on confidence, and confidence, Charles would learn, could be surprisingly fragile. During the early years of the 20th century, he found work at a bank in Montreal. At first glance, it seemed like the opportunity he had been waiting for. A respectable position. A chance to learn finance. A chance to observe how successful institutions operated. The bank catered largely to Italian immigrants, people who had crossed oceans carrying the same dreams Charles once carried. People looking for security, opportunity, a better life. The bank promised all of those things. There was only one problem. The bank itself was built on shaky foundations. To attract customers, it offered unusually high interest rates. Higher than competitors, higher than many believed possible. Yet the money kept flowing in. Customers trusted the institution. After all, others had already invested. The offices appeared legitimate. The employees appeared professional. Everything looked successful. Until it wasn't. Eventually, investigators discovered that the bank had been using new deposits to pay earlier investors. The business was not generating enough legitimate profit to support its promises. It needed constant new money to survive. And when that flow slowed, the entire system began to crack. For Charles, the experience was educational. Not because he admired the fraud, but because he witnessed something remarkable. People often believe what they want to believe, especially when money is involved. The bank's customers weren't stupid. Many were hard-working and cautious, but hope can cloud judgment, and financial promises can be surprisingly persuasive. When the institution finally collapsed, Charles found himself in serious trouble. Not because he had created the scheme, but because he became involved in activities connected to the failing bank. Authorities arrested him. He spent time in prison. It was a humiliating setback. Another failure. Another dream destroyed. Most people would have viewed prison as a warning. A signal to change direction. Charles viewed it differently. To him, it was simply another obstacle, another delay, another chapter in a story that he still believed would end in success. After his release, life did not become easier. He struggled again, moved again, tried again. There were more jobs, more disappointments, more failed attempts to achieve the wealth he craved. Years passed, then more years. By now, many people would have abandoned their grand ambitions. Charles did not. Because despite everything, he remained convinced of one thing. His breakthrough was still out there, waiting, hidden somewhere beyond the next opportunity, the next idea, the next conversation. And then one day it arrived. Not in a business meeting, not through a wealthy investor, not through a bank. It arrived in the mail, a simple letter, the kind of letter most people would read and forget. But Charles Ponzi was not most people, and hidden inside that letter was an idea that would change his life forever. Chapter 4. The Coupon. The idea that made Charles Ponzi famous did not begin with money. It began with postage. Not exactly the foundation of most financial empires, yet history often turns on unlikely details. In 1919, Charles received correspondence from a business contact in Europe. Inside the envelope was something called an international reply coupon. Most people had never heard of them. Few paid attention to them, but they played an important role in international communication. The concept was simple. Someone in one country could purchase a coupon and send it abroad. The recipient could then exchange that coupon for postage stamps needed to send a reply. It was a convenient solution to an international problem, at least in theory. For most people, the coupon was forgettable. For Charles Ponzi, it was a revelation, because the world had recently survived catastrophe. The First World War had ended only months earlier. Europe was exhausted, governments were rebuilding, currencies had become unstable, exchange rates fluctuated wildly. Economic systems were struggling to recover. And suddenly, Charles noticed something unusual. The price of an international reply coupon varied dramatically from one country to another. In some places, the coupon could be purchased relatively cheaply. Yet when redeemed elsewhere, it could be exchanged for postage worth significantly more. A gap existed, a difference in value, an arbitrage opportunity. Buy low, redeem high, profit from the difference. On paper, the idea appeared legitimate, even clever. In fact, historians generally agree that a small arbitrage opportunity genuinely existed. Charles had discovered something real, something most people had overlooked. For the first time in years, he wasn't chasing a fantasy. He had found an actual inefficiency, a flaw in the system. The problem was scale. The profits available through this method were relatively modest. Turning the idea into a large business would require enormous numbers of coupons, millions upon millions of them. International logistics, transportation, storage, administration, an operation of staggering complexity. But Charles was no longer thinking small. He rarely did. Where others saw a modest opportunity, he saw a fortune. Where others saw limitations, he saw possibilities. And somewhere between those two perspectives, a dangerous idea began to form. What if he could raise money? What if investors provided capital? What if he promised returns generated by this remarkable opportunity? The proposal sounded plausible. After all, the opportunity was real. The mathematics appeared impressive, and Charles believed he could explain it convincingly. Perhaps too convincingly, because once he started describing the opportunity to others, something extraordinary happened. People listened. Not just listened, they became excited. The promise was simple. Invest today, receive extraordinary returns in a matter of weeks. Not years, not decades, weeks. The kind of returns that traditional banks could never match. The kind of returns that transformed lives. The kind of returns that sounded almost impossible. And yet Charles spoke about them with complete confidence. Confidence is contagious, especially during uncertain times, and post-war America was full of uncertainty. People wanted opportunities, people wanted growth, people wanted hope. Charles Ponzi was about to offer all three. At least, that's what investors believed. What began as a small idea involving postal coupons was about to become something much larger, much more profitable, and much more dangerous. Because Charles had discovered the secret that drives almost every great financial mania in history. People don't invest in numbers, they invest in stories. And Charles Ponzi was about to tell one of the most persuasive stories ever sold. Chapter 5. The First Investors. Every financial empire begins with a handful of believers, before the crowds, before the headlines, before the millions. There are always a few people willing to take the first risk. For Charles Ponzi, those people were friends, acquaintances, and local investors. People who trusted him, people willing to listen, people willing to believe. Ponzi explained the opportunity with confidence. International reply coupons, currency differences, international arbitrage. The details sounded complicated. That helped. Most people did not fully understand the mechanics, but they understood the result. Profit. Lots of profit. Ponzi made an extraordinary promise. Invest today. Receive a 50% return in 45 days, or 100% in 90 days. Even by the standards of the era, the returns sounded incredible. But Charles had an advantage. He wasn't asking people to believe a fantasy. He was offering them a story that sounded just plausible enough, and sometimes that's all people need. The first investors handed over modest sums, a few $100s, a few thousand. Nothing extraordinary. At least not yet. Then something remarkable happened. When the investment period ended, Ponzi paid them. Exactly as promised, checks arrived on time, profits were real. Investors who expected excuses instead received money. And nothing creates trust faster than results. Imagine being one of those early investors. Perhaps you invested $500, a significant amount of money. You spend weeks wondering if you've made a mistake. Then one day a check arrives. The promised profit. Every dollar accounted for. Your skepticism begins to disappear. Your confidence begins to grow. You tell your family, your friends, your co-workers, not because you're trying to recruit them, because you're excited, because you've discovered something extraordinary. At least, that's what you believe, and that excitement spreads. One investor becomes 3, 3 become 10, 10 become 50. The growth is slow at first, but every great avalanche begins with a few loose stones. Soon Charles Ponzi noticed something fascinating. People weren't asking fewer questions after receiving profits. They were asking more. How much could they invest? Could they reinvest their earnings? Could family members join? Could friends participate? The opportunity was becoming contagious, and every successful payout made the next investment easier. Trust was multiplying faster than money. The irony is that the scheme's greatest strength wasn't finance, it was psychology. Once someone receives a return, skepticism becomes difficult. After all, they have evidence. A check, a profit, proof. What they don't realize is that proof can be manufactured, and Charles Ponzi was becoming increasingly skilled at manufacturing it. Because while investors celebrated their returns, something dangerous was happening beneath the surface. The business wasn't growing. The obligations were. Every new investor created a future promise. Every future promise required future money, and future money required future investors. The machine was beginning to move. The question was no longer whether it would grow. The question was how large it could become before reality caught up. Charles Ponzi was about to find out. And so was America. The factory worker. Imagine a factory worker named Antonio. He immigrated from Italy years earlier. Every dollar he earns comes from long shifts and hard labor. His hands are rough. His back aches. His savings account represents years of sacrifice. One evening, a friend tells him about Charles Ponzi. At first, Antonio laughs. 50% returns. Impossible, but then his friend shows him a check. Real money, real profit. Weeks later, Antonio invests. Not everything, just enough to test the opportunity. 45 days later, a check arrives. The promised return. For the first time, Antonio begins to wonder, what if this is real? Chapter 6. The Gold Rush. The transformation happened quickly, then all at once. One day, Charles Ponzi was a little-known businessman in Boston. A few months later, he was one of the most talked-about men in America. Word spread through neighborhoods, factories, churches, restaurants, barbershops, social clubs. Everywhere people discussed the same opportunity. The same returns, the same mysterious financial genius. People who had never invested before suddenly became investors. People who distrusted banks trusted Ponzi. People who had spent years saving became willing to risk everything. The lines outside his offices began growing longer. Then longer still. Some people arrived before dawn. Others traveled from neighboring states. Many brought cash, some brought life savings. A few borrowed money simply to invest it. And every day the crowd seemed larger than the day before. Imagine walking through Boston during the summer of 1920. You hear conversations everywhere, at train stations, inside cafes, on street corners. Everyone seems to know someone making money through Ponzi. A neighbor, a cousin, a co-worker, a friend. The stories reinforce one another, and when enough people repeat the same story, it begins to feel true, even if it isn't. One factory worker invests a few $100s. 45 days later, he receives exactly what was promised. His co-workers watch closely. Soon they invest too. A widow places her savings into Ponzi's company. Imagine a widow named Margaret. Her husband spent 20 years building a modest savings account. After his death, that money became her security, her future, her protection against uncertainty. She hears neighbors discussing Charles Ponzi. Everyone seems to know someone making money. Everyone seems confident. Eventually, she invests a portion of her savings, then another portion, then more. The profits arrive exactly as promised. For the first time in years, she feels optimistic. Perhaps her future is secure after all. Perhaps fortune has finally smiled on her. She has no way of knowing that thousands of others are thinking exactly the same thing. The profits arrive. She tells her relatives. They invest. A small business owner reinvests everything he earns, then encourages others to follow. The cycle repeats. Again, and again, and again. Hope spreads faster than facts. And Charles Ponzi has become the center of a financial fever. Newspapers begin writing about him. Some articles praise him, others question him. Many simply marvel at the phenomenon. Who is this immigrant making fortunes appear from nowhere? How has he discovered something no bank seems capable of replicating? Why are thousands of people trusting him? The attention only fuels the excitement. Because publicity creates legitimacy. The more people hear about Ponzi, the more credible he appears. Surely, they reason, authorities would stop him if something were wrong. Surely newspapers would expose him. Surely someone would intervene. But nobody does, not yet. And so the money continues flowing. By some estimates, millions of dollars pour into Ponzi's operation. Every day brings new investors. Every day brings larger obligations. Every day increases the pressure. Yet from the outside, everything appears perfect. Charles dresses impeccably, lives comfortably, projects confidence, success surrounds him. Reporters interview him, investors admire him, strangers seek his advice. For the first time in his life, Charles Ponzi has achieved what he always wanted: recognition, status, influence. He has become the success story he dreamed of as a young man in Italy, the immigrant who conquered America, the man who discovered a hidden path to wealth, the financial genius who cracked the code. But beneath the surface, a dangerous truth remains hidden. The machine is hungry. It requires constant feeding, constant growth, constant confidence. Because the moment investors stop arriving, the moment confidence begins to crack, everything changes. And far away from the crowds, a few people are starting to ask uncomfortable questions. Questions about the coupons, questions about the numbers, questions about the math, questions that Charles Ponzi cannot afford to answer. Because sometimes the biggest threat to a great story is reality. Chapter 7. The Impossible Math. Every great illusion depends on distance. The farther people stand from the truth, the easier it becomes to believe the impossible. For months, Charles Ponzi had benefited from that distance. Investors saw checks, they saw profits, they saw crowds, they saw success. What they did not see were the numbers behind the curtain, and eventually someone decided to look. Imagine being a newspaper reporter in Boston during the summer of 1920. Every morning, you pass crowds lining the sidewalks. People talk about little else. Some claim Ponzi is a genius. Others call him a miracle worker. A few insist he has discovered a secret hidden inside the global financial system. Yet something feels wrong. Not because people are making money, they are. The checks are real, the profits are real. at least for now. What bothers you is scale, the numbers, the sheer size of the operation. So one day you sit down with a notebook, a pencil, and a simple question. If Charles Ponzi is really making money through international reply coupons, how many coupons would he need? At first, the calculations seem confusing. Then they become alarming. Then they become impossible. Because the more money investors hand to Ponzi, the more coupons he would need to purchase. Not thousands, not hundreds of thousands, millions, then tens of millions, then far more than experts believe even exist. The numbers stop making sense. Yet the money keeps flowing. And when mathematics collides with belief, mathematics usually loses the first battle. The questions begin quietly. Financial experts raise eyebrows. Bankers exchange skeptical looks. Economists start examining the claims. Postal officials become curious. After all, if millions of coupons are moving through the system, someone should notice. Someone should be shipping them, storing them, redeeming them, accounting for them. But evidence remains strangely absent. No giant warehouses, no massive transportation network, no army of employees processing coupons around the clock. Nothing that matches the scale required. The deeper investigators look, the stranger the story becomes. Meanwhile, Charles remains confident. Publicly, at least. Whenever critics question him, he responds with certainty. Whenever reporters ask difficult questions, he offers explanations. Sometimes complicated explanations, sometimes vague explanations, but always confident explanations. And confidence remains one of the most persuasive forces in human psychology, especially when money is involved, because many investors no longer want answers. They want validation. They want reassurance. Most importantly, they want their profits. One newspaper investigation produces an especially uncomfortable conclusion. Based on available information, the number of coupons required for Ponzi's operation exceeds anything remotely realistic. The system simply cannot support the returns being promised. The math refuses to cooperate. The numbers refuse to cooperate. Reality itself refuses to cooperate. Yet thousands continue investing anyway. Why? Because people trust experience more than analysis. A newspaper article is theoretical, a profit check is tangible, an economist can warn you. But a successful withdrawal feels like proof. And for many investors, proof wins, at least temporarily. This pattern has repeated throughout history, again and again. A warning appears, experts raise concerns, skeptics ask questions. But while the money continues flowing, few people want to listen. Success creates its own credibility. And Charles Ponzi appears successful beyond anyone's imagination. The crowds are larger than ever. The deposits are larger than ever. The headlines are larger than ever. From the outside, the empire looks unstoppable. But inside, pressure is building. Because every day brings more obligations, more promised returns, more future payments, and fewer places to hide. Imagine trying to balance a tower made entirely of confidence. Each investor adds another block. Each promised return adds another block. Each newspaper article removes a little support. At first, the structure appears stable. Then tiny cracks appear, almost invisible, easy to ignore, until suddenly they aren't. The first cracks begin spreading through Boston. Questions become investigations. Investigations become headlines. Headlines become fear, and fear travels much faster than optimism. The same crowds that once lined up to invest can just as easily line up to withdraw. The same confidence that built the empire can destroy it. All it takes is a shift in belief, a single moment when enough people stop asking, "What if I miss this opportunity?" and start asking, "What if everyone else is right?" For Charles Ponzi, that moment is approaching rapidly. The machine that made him famous is still running, but now it is running on borrowed time and borrowed confidence. Soon both will run out. Chapter 8. The Collapse. The collapse begins the way many collapses do, not with a crash, with a rumor, a question, a doubt, something small, something easy to dismiss, until it isn't. Throughout the summer of 1920, criticism grows louder. Newspapers publish investigations. Financial experts challenge Ponzi's claims. Government officials begin paying closer attention, and investors start hearing something they haven't heard before. Bad news. At first, many ignore it. After all, Charles has been right before, the critics have been wrong before, the checks keep arriving, the profits keep appearing. Why panic? Why doubt success? Why abandon a miracle? But confidence is fragile, and once uncertainty enters the system, it spreads. One investor decides to withdraw funds, then another, then another. Soon, people who once rushed to invest are rushing for something else. The exit. Imagine arriving at Ponzi's office one morning. The line looks familiar. But something has changed. The mood feels different. People aren't smiling. They aren't discussing profits. They aren't talking about opportunity. They're talking about risk. They're talking about rumors. They're talking about whether their money is safe. And once that question enters people's minds, it becomes difficult to remove. Charles attempts to reassure everyone. He makes public statements, conducts interviews, projects confidence, the same confidence that carried him from obscurity to fame. For a brief moment, it works. Some investors calm down, some remain loyal, some continue believing, but belief is becoming harder to maintain because the investigations keep coming, the questions keep coming, and the answers keep getting weaker. Then authorities uncover the truth. The operation is nowhere near what Charles claimed. The coupon business cannot possibly support the money flowing through the company. The profits are not coming from international arbitrage. They are coming from new investors. The illusion finally shatters. When the news breaks, panic erupts. Thousands of people suddenly realize they may never see their money again. Some lose savings, some lose businesses, some lose fortunes. Many lose trust. The very thing Charles Ponzi had mastered, the very thing that built his empire, the very thing that is now destroying it. In August 1920, authorities arrest Charles Ponzi, the financial genius, the miracle worker, the immigrant success story, the man who seemed capable of creating wealth from thin air. Now standing before cameras and investigators, the crowds disappear, the admiration disappears. The legend begins transforming into something else, a cautionary tale. Yet even during the collapse, something remarkable happens. Many investors continue defending him. Some insist he is innocent. Others insist he will recover. A few refuse to believe the evidence entirely, because the most difficult lie to abandon is the lie we want to be true. And millions of dollars had been invested in believing. The empire collapses, the money disappears, the dream ends. But the story is far from over, because Charles Ponzi's greatest impact on history wasn't the fortune he made, or the fortune he lost. It was the lesson he left behind, a lesson the world would continue learning for more than a century. Sometimes the most dangerous investment isn't money, it's belief. Chapter 9. Prison, Exile and Ruin. When Charles Ponzi entered prison, he was one of the most famous men in America. Not respected, not admired, but famous. His name appeared in newspapers across the country. His face was instantly recognizable. His story had become a national obsession. The rise had been spectacular. The fall was even more dramatic. For investigators, the evidence was overwhelming. The business that had supposedly generated enormous profits through international reply coupons had never operated on the scale Ponzi claimed. The numbers simply didn't exist. The logistics didn't exist. The profits didn't exist. What existed was a system dependent on one thing: new investors. As long as money flowed in, earlier investors could be paid. Once the flow slowed, the illusion collapsed. Yet even after his arrest, Charles Ponzi remained remarkably optimistic. Some might call it denial. Others might call it confidence. Perhaps it was both. Throughout his life, Charles had always believed that the next opportunity was waiting around the corner. The next breakthrough, the next comeback, the next reinvention. And prison wasn't enough to destroy that belief. Imagine sitting alone in a prison cell after becoming one of the most talked about men in America. Just months earlier, reporters wanted interviews. Investors wanted advice. Strangers wanted photographs. Now the crowds are gone. The headlines have moved on. The money has vanished. All that remains are consequences. For many people, such an experience would force a complete reassessment of their life. For Charles Ponzi, it became another chapter, another setback, another obstacle to overcome. After serving time, he attempted to rebuild. Again, and again, and again. Because one thing never changed, his belief that he was destined for something bigger. Even after one of the most infamous financial scandals in American history, Charles continued searching for opportunities, searching for reinvention, searching for success. The pattern that had defined his entire life refused to disappear. Eventually, authorities deported him. The immigrant who had once arrived in America chasing fortune now left under very different circumstances. The dream that had brought him across the Atlantic had ended in disgrace, yet Charles remained Charles. Always searching, always planning, always imagining a comeback. Years later, he found himself in Brazil, far from Boston, far from the crowds, far from the headlines that once made him famous. The contrast was striking. The man who had controlled millions of dollars now struggled financially. The man who had attracted investors from across the nation now lived in relative obscurity. The man whose promises had inspired thousands now possessed very little himself. History can be cruel in its symmetry. Charles Ponzi spent much of his life chasing wealth, yet wealth proved remarkably difficult to keep. He spent years creating the image of success, yet the image ultimately outlived the reality. He convinced others that fortunes could appear quickly, yet his own fortune disappeared just as quickly. As the years passed, the legend remained larger than the man. People remembered the scheme, the headlines, the scandal, the crowds. Few remembered the aging Charles himself, the dreamer from Italy, the ambitious immigrant, the man who spent his life pursuing success and rarely stopped long enough to ask what success actually meant. In 1949, Charles Ponzi died in Brazil. He was 66 years old. His bank account contained very little money. The vast fortune was gone. The empire was gone. The crowds were gone. At first glance, it seemed like an unremarkable ending. Another failed businessman, another forgotten criminal, another life swallowed by history. But history had other plans. Because Charles Ponzi was about to achieve something few people ever do. He was about to become immortal. Not through wealth, not through achievement, but through an idea. Chapter 10. The Legacy. Most criminals are eventually forgotten. Their names fade, their stories disappear, their crimes become footnotes. Charles Ponzi became something else, a warning. Today, more than a century after his scheme collapsed, his name still appears in headlines. Not because people are studying Charles Ponzi, but because people keep repeating his mistake. Or perhaps more accurately, humanity keeps repeating the same mistake. Consider how many times history has replayed the pattern. A charismatic figure appears. A revolutionary opportunity is announced. Extraordinary returns are promised. Early investors make money. Word spreads. Crowds gather. Skeptics are ignored. Questions are dismissed. The system grows. The excitement grows. The confidence grows. Then reality arrives, and everything collapses. The details change. The technology changes. The industries change. But the psychology remains remarkably consistent. Because Charles Ponzi never discovered a weakness in financial systems. He discovered a weakness in human nature. People want to believe. They want to believe that someone has found a shortcut, a secret, a hidden opportunity, a way to achieve extraordinary rewards without ordinary sacrifice. The promise changes with every generation, but the temptation remains the same. Think about it. If someone offers a modest return over 10 years, few people become excited. If someone promises extraordinary returns in weeks, people pay attention, not because they're foolish, because they're human. Hope is persuasive. Greed is persuasive. Desperation is persuasive. And when those emotions combine, skepticism often disappears. That may be Charles Ponzi's greatest lesson. Not that people are gullible, not that people are unintelligent, but that intelligence alone does not protect us. Many of Ponzi's investors were smart, experienced, successful. Yet they wanted to believe, and wanting to believe can be more powerful than evidence. In many ways, Charles Ponzi understood something fundamental about humanity. People rarely buy investments, they buy stories. Stories about the future, stories about opportunity, stories about who they might become. The numbers matter, but the story matters more. And Charles was one of history's greatest storytellers. The fact that his story wasn't true almost became secondary, at least until reality intervened. This is what makes him such a fascinating anti-hero. He wasn't a conqueror, he wasn't a pirate, he wasn't a king. He didn't command armies, he didn't rule nations. His weapon was belief, and for a brief moment, belief proved stronger than facts, stronger than mathematics, stronger than reality itself, at least temporarily. But reality is patient. Eventually it catches everyone. Charles Ponzi learned that lesson. So did his investors, and every generation since has had to learn it again. The irony is almost perfect. Charles Ponzi spent his life searching for a way to become rich. Instead, he became famous. Far more famous than he ever imagined. His fortune disappeared, his empire collapsed, his name survived. More than 100 years later, the world still remembers him. Not because of what he built, but because of what he revealed. A truth about markets, a truth about trust, and perhaps most importantly, a truth about ourselves. Because whenever an opportunity seems too good to be true, whenever extraordinary returns appear out of nowhere, whenever crowds begin believing that the old rules no longer apply, the ghost of Charles Ponzi quietly returns, reminding us that human nature changes far more slowly than technology, and that the most powerful force in finance has never been money. It's belief. History is full of people like Charles Ponzi, people who challenged systems, manipulated trust, and changed the world in ways nobody expected. If you enjoy exploring the minds, motives, and strategies of history's most fascinating anti-heroes, consider subscribing and tell us in the comments, who should we examine next? Until next time.